Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. We have a new U.S. plan for a peace agreement in Ukraine, which includes territorial concessions difficult for Ukraine to accept, but not so bad that it's a non-starter. The proposal also deals with security guarantees, limits on the size of the Ukrainian army, EU membership for Ukraine, a shared Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, reparations, and reconstruction. We'll take a deep dive into the points of the plan with our guest, but first, let's take a look at the latest reports from Ukraine this week. This week, Ukraine's diplomacy intensified across Europe and Washington, even as Russian strikes continued to hit civilian areas and frontline towns across the country. On Monday, leaders of the UK, Ukraine, France, and Germany met in London for another round of peace talks. From Brussels, Zelensky flew to Rome to meet with Pope Leo and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. They discussed humanitarian issues, energy security, and the next steps in the peace process. Ukraine and the European Commission unveiled a 10-point reform roadmap on Thursday to steer Kyiv's EU accession bid over the next 2 years, with ministers meeting in Lviv calling Ukraine's membership inevitable, despite Hungary's objections. The plan confirms fresh EU support, including 4.1 billion euros under the ERA initiative and 1.8 billion euros from the Ukraine Peace Facility, and commits Kyiv to sweeping anti-corruption and judicial reforms. In Washington, President Donald Trump said on Thursday that the U.S. would only join upcoming Europe-based ceasefire talks if there is a real chance of progress. Speaking to the coalition of the willing, Zelensky said Ukraine is ready to work with Trump in, quote, any format, including on elections, but only with security guarantees.
Ukraine is not hiding from democracy, but to make elections possible, there must be a security component, and America can help with this the most. If there is a need for elections now, there must be a ceasefire at least during election process and during voting.
The Ukrainian leader said his country could hold elections within 3 months if Western partners provide firm security guarantees. Zelensky has asked Parliament to prepare legal changes to allow elections under martial law, as his term, which was due to end in 2024, was postponed following Russia's full-scale invasion. On Friday, Ukraine denied reports that it had agreed to the creation of a buffer or demilitarized zone in eastern Donbas. President Zelensky's communications advisor, Dmytro Litvin, said information published by the French daily Le Monde was incorrect, stressing that Kyiv has not consented to any arrangement that would involve withdrawing Ukrainian forces or conceding territory. Russian forces carried out daily drone, missile, and guided bomb attacks across Ukraine. The Zaporizhzhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, and Odessa regions were all hit, with civilian areas, transport hubs, and energy infrastructure repeatedly targeted. In the Sumy region, a guided bomb hit a shop in Velika Pisarivka during business hours, killing 2 women. In Pavlohrad, Russian drones set multiple homes on fire, destroying at least 1 completely. In southern Ukraine, drone strikes on Odessa damaged gas and power infrastructure, leaving parts of the city without electricity and water. Further attacks across Kharkiv and Donetsk regions on Thursday and Friday damaged residential buildings, schools, and commercial sites. In Kherson, Russian shelling wounded at least 9 people in a single day, while continued strikes on Nikopol and the Dnipropetrovsk region killed 1 civilian and knocked out power lines. And now joining us to discuss this potential U.S. peace plan is Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, now let's go ahead and start off with the Donbas in this proposal. It's a very contentious issue. Ukraine obviously doesn't want to give up, especially the territories that it controls. However, Russia said it has to have the whole entire thing. Do you think that Ukraine will agree to give up those territory, those major cities in the fortress belt, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and under what conditions, and who will control it at the end of the day?
So it's a good question, and I'm glad you noted that Russia said it has to have it. Of course, Putin has long said he needs Ukraine, and he has reiterated his maximalist aims for years. So I do not think there's a change in the Russian position that they want all of the Donbas and they want more of Ukraine. President Zelensky has shown a genuine and also smart strategic messaging about his interest and willingness to compromise. So he's been engaging in all these diplomatic talks, saying what Ukraine is willing to do and pointing out what's most important for them. Donbas is one of these most complex and controversial points for many reasons. But President Zelensky has also said, we can talk about territorial concessions, but that he has no right constitutionally, and he also says morally, to make that decision. So he's pointed out, even if Ukraine, under his view, is willing to talk about giving up territory under whatever configuration that might be of a demilitarized zone or a free economic zone, he says that would need to go to the Ukrainian people in a referendum or an election. From what I understand on the proposals that are being discussed right now, there isn't a great deal of detail, and there isn't full clarity on what the vision is for what that Donbas region would look like. So I don't think that's been solved yet.
Okay, I was going to hold this for later, but let's go ahead and get it into it right now, because President Zelensky has also talked about elections. And obviously, every discussion surrounding elections during martial law has always been met with that reaction that it can't be done under the Constitution. Therefore, now he's said, okay, let's go ahead and have elections. But for elections to take place, we need to have safety, security, a ceasefire, all of these, which he knows that Russia will not agree to. And this leaves Donald Trump in a very difficult situation. Is it the same thing with the Donbas? Because I would imagine to have a referendum, you also need a ceasefire, you need safety, you need to be able to, carry out a ballot vote. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Those core issues for a referendum or election or any of these democratic processes, those all remain. And so, again, I think this is President Zelensky showing his willingness to compromise, showing that he's listening to Washington, and there is a legitimate need still for martial law. There is a constitutional reason that elections can't be held under martial law, but President Zelensky is willing to open up the conversations about looking to have those. But he has pointed to the most critical aspect, and that's security guarantees. And that's needed for a lot of reasons. It's needed logistically to make sure that the polling stations, for instance, wouldn't be attacked. And we know that Russia is attacking schools, hospitals, apartments, anything every day. So there's no reason to think without a ceasefire or a peace in place and security guarantees, this would be possible. Also, it needs to be democratic. There needs to be a way for people that have been displaced in the country to participate, perhaps people abroad, and for people that are serving in the armed forces. So there's a lot of issues at hand that logistically make it difficult. But of course, Putin has to agree to some type of ceasefire. There has to be agreements on security guarantees. So I don't think elections are coming anytime soon. But I think once again, President Zelensky is showing that Ukraine is not the obstacle here.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant tactic by President Zelensky. Well, President Zelensky is floating this special economic zone, right, in that remaining 30% of the Donbas, which is controlled by Ukraine. Now, Russia is saying that it won't put its military assets there, but it wants full control of the Donbas. So even if it's demilitarized, either way, won't it still remain to be a bone of contention that could spark future resumption of hostilities?
Yes, I think there is a serious risk for that region in general. And if Russia has any ounce of control, whether that's, I think they floated having, their police or their National Guard or some other non-military presence, we know what those Russian forces in any capacity do to Ukrainian civilians. And we know that Russians are great at looking for opportunities for destabilizing. So there has to be some type of monitoring put in place that I think has a international aspect. I don't believe those details have been worked out, but if President Trump really wants to get a peace that sticks and doesn't become an issue again in 6 months, 2 years, or longer, then this really needs to be sorted out in a way that can mean actual stability. And with that comes the possibility for economic prosperity for Ukraine, too.
Right now, what about Crimea? Zelensky just recently said that Ukraine simply doesn't have the power and the resources to take it back, something that we haven't heard ever since 2014. The U.S. proposal says that the control of Crimea, the LNR, the DNR will be cemented, and that any changes must be through diplomacy only. So what do you think that this really means? Will the United States, for instance, recognize these territories as legit Russian sovereign territory?
I think it's a great tragedy that we barely hear Crimea even coming up right now, because there are, of course, still people there under Russian occupation. I think President Zelensky is saying what's been known for a long time and what many in Ukraine agree on, that Crimea is not likely to change hands anytime soon. As for where the U.S. lands on recognizing, that has been contentious over the past year or so. Different ideas and proposals have been floated about if there's legal recognition or just de facto, and there's been pushback in the U.S. about the idea of ignoring the standards of international law. And if we in the U.S. were to recognize Crimea as legally Russian, that would be a mistake, and I don't think we're going in that direction, but different ideas often pop up here. But fortunately, even in the Republican Party, there seems to be pushback on that one.
Well, and that also brings us to the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which will be frozen on the front lines with the recognition of current control. Do you think this would be acceptable to either side? It seems like Ukraine is entertaining this idea. Do you think the Russians will entertain the idea? Because Russia wants the whole pie, right?
They certainly do. Once again, Ukraine has been showing that they are willing to make some hard decisions, do some compromise, and Ukraine has put forward that they would like to see a decision and a ceasefire and an agreement along the line of contact. And Zaporizhia is very important. Russia wants it because they want everything. I think they want to prevent Ukraine from having an economic future, and they continue to hit all the energy infrastructure in Ukraine now. So they want to prevent them from having the energy. President Zelensky has pointed out that Zaporizhia, the power plant there, is important for Ukraine. There might be a U.S. role, some international role. As for the regions, if it were to be along the line of contact, Ukraine would agree. It's hard to imagine Russia agreeing right now, perhaps if more pressure is put on them. But any agreement they make saying that they would, give up their aims on that area has to come with security guarantees for Ukraine too, because you can never hold Russia to their word.
Yeah, it seems like in this proposal, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant will be split 50-50. Maybe the U.S. will monitor or control that in some way. But it raises another question, because if this is being floated for Kherson and Zaporizhia, that they freeze the conflict along the current lines, and Russia has what it has, I just don't understand why Russia insists on taking the administrative capitals in Donetsk, Luhansk, right? Luhansk it has, but in Donetsk with Kramatorsk, Why couldn't they just freeze the current lines of contact?
There's no reason why they couldn't. I mean, looking for logic in a Kremlin position is a fool's errand. I believe that they certainly could accept that. They could spin it anyway. The Russian budget for 2026 has even increased what they're spending on propaganda. So they would be fine in their own information space. Putin can sell this as a win, but it comes back to his core interest that he wants more of Ukraine. And I think he wants to just, mess with the Ukrainians in any way he can. So if these are sticking points, that's another way to make it difficult in negotiations and drag this on. And the Russians think that time is on their side. And hopefully that's not the case.
Hopefully it is not the case. Well, I'm wondering where we're going to get with this. And so let's move on to the security guarantees. In terms of security guarantees, we hear something like a solid Article 5-like provision that's not legally binding. I don't know what this means. Ukraine already has security guarantees guaranteed to it by the Budapest Memorandum. Those are legally binding, but they're not upheld or respected. So what is the bare minimum that you think that Ukraine can accept in this current situation? Or should accept?
I think that good point. I think that Ukraine is starting to look at some of these bilateral aspects of security guarantees as well. So regarding a U.S. participation in some way, President Zelensky and others in Ukraine have said that they want to see anything that's agreed to go through Congress and become legally mandated as well, because they have been burned in the past and they're right to push for that. And they can look for other bilateral security arrangements that all fall under this umbrella of security guarantees. There's a lot of talk about the coalition of the willing and if they can have, troops in some aspect. But Ukraine, at the bare minimum, needs to make sure it's more than just a signature on a paper and goodwill that could change with different political administrations in Europe and the US. I think they need some legal aspect, and they need to have some, buffer with Russia. And there's a lot of that logistical aspects that go into it. And Ukrainians are very smart, have been looking at this. I don't have the details of the plan. And frankly, I don't know how detailed the plans have been. But that security guarantees is the key sticking point for Ukraine to be able to have a future rebuild and also hopefully have some more people come home.
Right. Now, there's also supposed to be no NATO troops stationed in Ukraine, which begs the question, who will monitor the ceasefire or this peace agreement and under what conditions? Would that exclude...
That I do not have the answer to.
Yeah. Well, if you would, if you would suggest something in this case, because we've seen the OSCE, we've seen, how they monitor in the Donbas, and the toothlessness of the organization was really not able to do anything except report to both sides. I would imagine it's the same thing with the United Nations. So I don't know. Could there be an option like the Coalition of the Willing? Could the Coalition of the Willing, not under a NATO mission, send peacekeeping troops, whatever you want to call them, to monitor this ceasefire and hopefully be backed up with those security guarantees that you mentioned?
I think that's the main option that's being looked at, and certainly one that Ukraine will be comfortable with, because you can have a coalition of countries, and there's a lot of merit in having as many flags as possible. So there's a couple dozen countries that are talking about this already, and more could potentially join. And they need to have the ability to monitor. Ukraine's contact and frontline is massive, so there will be a lot of tech components to this, and that's being discussed. But there also needs to be, a system of monitoring and reporting on what is considered a violation. And that's where we've seen some failures also in the past. There's talk about UN pulling together different missions and bringing in some of the countries that perhaps Russia is less likely to fire upon. But I think a lot more work needs to be done on the logistics. But Ukraine will have to be comfortable with whatever is sorted, and it'll be interesting to see if Russia will ever agree to anything that Ukraine is comfortable with.
Right. Exactly. Well, also, there's the idea of a DMZ has been floated. The front lines in Ukraine are, 1,000 kilometers, maybe 1,200 kilometers. So would it look like something that we see in North Korea? Would that be tenable, in your opinion?
So there's been a lot of different terms thrown out. DMZ certainly is one of them. But I think we're moving away from that a little bit, because there's key differences with the DMZ in North Korea. There's massive troop presence. And so the U.S. role is clearly committed there. And, the size is also different. So I don't think that model is replicable exactly. There's going to be some combination of drones, of mines, of monitoring, but it'll look different.
Yeah, and then there's the limitations on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. It was originally floated to be 600,000. Now that's been bumped up to 800,000 troops. Do you think that'd be acceptable for Ukraine? How large of a force should it maintain to serve as a deterrent to further Russian aggression?
I think I believe President Zelensky has made a comment on that recently. If he, said at the larger 800,000 that's doable, I think that makes sense for deterrent force. What's most important is Ukrainians don't want to feel that Russia is dictating their force, and they shouldn't be able to.
Mm-hmm. Reparations, only $100 billion from frozen Russian assets are supposed to be allocated to Ukraine, $400 billion from BlackRock all of a sudden, and the World Bank. And Donald Trump wants the same from Russia. How will Ukraine rebuild, do you think, if we're able to get over the line and get to that point?
Well, the getting over the line and to that point is the critical part, because I think there's a lot of potential in Ukraine and that the international business community sees that. But many of them are hesitant to go in for various reasons, insurance, liability, and just waiting to see how it shakes out politically and security-wise. So there's a lot that can be done in Ukraine if we're building them up, tapping into their great resources, whether that's minerals, whether that's agricultural, there's AI, there's a lot of tech talent. So a lot could be done there to build their economy. Of course, there's the infrastructure rebuilding needed too. But without security guarantees, it's hard to imagine a massive international presence, both in a government and private sector capacity. But there's a lot of smart people in Ukraine and internationally that have been putting together plans, looking at this and how it would connect to EU path, et cetera. But getting to that point, as you said, getting across the line is really the key issue at hand.
Yep, and it will be difficult, of course. But going through these points, I see now that there are some points where they might be able to come close together. We've heard millions of times that a good peace deal is not going to make either side happy, right? So we also hear Russia wanting amnesty for war crimes. You have the International Criminal Court, the indictment against Vladimir Putin and others for the kidnapped children or the abducted children of Ukraine. Now we have an ICJ case that is pending for genocide. What happens on that front? Do you think there's any conceivable way that Ukraine would accept any kind of amnesty for Russia after this horrible, horrible, horrible war?
That is a really difficult question, because there's also there's a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, and there's a lot going on domestically in the Ukrainian court system looking at different cases. I think that will be very difficult for Ukrainians to accept, but I think that many people are realistic and they don't expect to see Putin in The Hague anytime soon. And so while I believe it would be a shame to not see him and others held accountable in the near-term future, I think that is a point that Ukrainians will be willing to compromise on.
Do you think it's an essential point that needs to be in these first stages of getting to a ceasefire?
Well, for the ultimate peace, I don't see Putin signing anything that doesn't have amnesty for him at the very least. I'm not sure how much concern he has for his soldiers, seeing as he puts them through the meat grinder regularly and others around him, but he will look out for himself.
Well, as Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that's all the time we have on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. If you ever miss an episode, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel. You know where to find it, TVP World. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.